The church was filled with a heavy silence, the kind that pressed down on the chest like an invisible weight. Rows of uniformed officers and soldiers stood in solemn formation, their white gloved hands clasped in front of them. Their faces were stoic, but marked with grief. The polished wooden casket at the front of the altar seemed too small for the amount of sorrow it carried inside. Nestled in a bed of soft white fabric lay Orion, a German shepherd who had been more than just a K-9 officer. His black and tan coat still gleamed under the dim light, his ears slightly raised as if he were still listening for a command. To an outsider, he might have looked like he was merely sleeping, but everyone in that room knew the heartbreaking truth. Orion would never wake up again. Standing at the foot of the casket, Lieutenant Cashin, Holt tried to keep his composure. His posture was straight, disciplined, but his hands trembled at his sides. Orion had been his partner for 6 years, his protector, his unwavering companion through war zones and life-threatening missions. They had saved each other's lives more times than he could count, and now, for the first time, Cashin stood alone. The realization gnawed at him, deep and unbearable. How do you say goodbye to the one who never left your side? The chapel was packed beyond capacity. K-9 handlers, fellow soldiers, law enforcement officers, and even civilians had gathered to pay their respects. Some had never met Orion but had heard stories of his bravery, times when he had taken down armed threats, sniffed out hidden explosives, or shielded his handler from gunfire. He wasn't just a dog. He was a hero, a legend, and now his watch had ended. As the chaplain spoke, his voice solemn and steady, Cashin barely heard him. His heartbeat was too loud, his thoughts too heavy. The moment felt unreal, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. Slowly, he took a step forward, his fingers reaching up to his own uniform. He unpinned his Medal of Honor, an award he had received for a mission he would never have survived if not for Orion, and with a trembling hand, placed it gently on the dog's chest. His voice, though barely above a whisper, carried through the silent room. "You did your duty, partner. Now rest." A soft, choked sob broke the silence from somewhere in the crowd. Someone wiped away tears. Others lowered their heads in quiet mourning. The weight of Orion's absence was suffocating, but what no one in that room knew, what no one could have predicted, was that Orion's story was far from over. Something was about to happen, something that would leave everyone in that church questioning everything they thought they knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the bond that never dies. If you've made it this far, it's because the story touched your heart. So, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue bringing you incredible animal stories. Oh, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Let's reach 100,000 subscribers and go even further together. I'm counting on you. The funeral ended, but the weight of loss lingered like a heavy fog. Officers filed out of the church in silence, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Some stopped briefly by the casket to pay their final respects, their gloved hands resting gently on the polished wood before turning away. Cashin, however, couldn't move. He remained rooted in place, staring at Orion's still form, his chest tightening with each passing second. The thought of walking away, of leaving him behind, felt unbearable. A firm yet gentle hand rested on his shoulder. It was Captain Elias Monroe, his commanding officer and longtime mentor. He stood beside him, his weathered face etched with sorrow, his gray eyes understanding. "It's time, Lieutenant," he said. Cashin inhaled sharply, forcing down the lump in his throat. With one last lingering look at his partner, he nodded. He straightened his shoulders, gave Orion a final salute, and turned away. But as he took his first step, something strange happened. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the soft jingle of a collar, echoed through the emptying church. Cashin froze. He knew that sound. He had heard it countless times during night patrols, high-risk missions, and quiet moments back at base. It was a sound of Orion shifting, his tags clinking together. He turned sharply, his breath caught in his throat, but the casket remained closed, untouched. Orion lay exactly as he had before, yet the sound still rang in Cashin's ears, too real to be a trick of the mind. A cold chill crept down his spine. "Did you hear that?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe frowned. Hear what? Cashin hesitated. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe my mind was playing cruel tricks on me. Shaking his head, he dismissed it. Nothing. Let's go outside. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the scent of impending rain. Officers and soldiers gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. The honor guard stood at attention near the hearse, ready for the final transport to Orion's burial site. Cashin's hands curled into fists at his sides. This was it, the final goodbye. But as he approached the vehicle, another sound stopped him dead in his tracks, a low growl. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. His heart pounded. He turned abruptly, scanning the area. His fellow officers didn't seem to notice anything unusual. No one reacted. No one moved. But Cashin knew what he had heard. And for the first time since Orion's death, he felt something other than grief. He felt watched. The growl had faded, but its echo remained lodged in Cashin's mind, like a splinter he couldn't remove. He stood near the hearse, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His breath was slow and controlled. Too controlled. It was the kind of breath a soldier takes when his instincts scream that something is off. The funeral procession continued as expected. Officers moved in synchronized precision, their silence heavy with grief. But Cashin could no longer focus. That sound, the low, guttural, unmistakably canine growl, had come from somewhere close. He forced himself to move, stepping forward as Orion's casket was carried toward the open grave. Each footstep felt heavier than the last, like he was sinking into the earth with every step. The air felt thicker, charged with something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just grief or exhaustion. It was something else. Pressure, presence. He had felt it before on missions in the dead of night, when unseen eyes tracked his every movement. But this wasn't an enemy lurking in the shadows. This was something he couldn't name. The chaplain's voice carried over the rain as the honor guard folded the American flag with precise, practiced movements. Cashin barely heard it. His senses were locked onto the weight pressing against his skin, the eerie certainty that he was not alone. When the folded flag was placed in his hands, his fingers curled around the fabric, his knuckles turning white. He swallowed hard, staring at the casket as the first shovel full of dirt was lowered onto the polished wood. The sound was dull, hollow, final. But as the dirt landed, something changed. A sound, faint and almost hidden beneath the falling rain. Panting. Cashin's breath hitched. It was soft, rhythmic, the unmistakable sound of a dog at rest. His grip on the flag tightened. He turned his head slightly, scanning the rows of officers. None of them had moved. None of them carried a dog. The cemetery was still, yet the sound persisted just at the edge of his hearing, just real enough to make his skin crawl. Then, beyond the sea of uniforms, past the graves lined in perfect rows, he saw it, a shadow, barely visible through the mist and falling rain. Large, canine, motionless, watching, his chest constricted, his heartbeat roared in his ears. Every logical part of him told him it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion, a shape formed by the fog. But every instinct told him something different. Every instinct told him he wasn't imagining this. He blinked just for a second, and when he looked again, the shadow was gone. The drive back home was silent. The rain had eased into a slow drizzle, tapping against the windshield in a rhythmic pattern. Cashin gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles pale from the pressure. His mind replayed the moment at the cemetery over and over, the shadow, the panting, the feeling that Orion was still there, watching. Every logical part of him screamed that it was grief playing tricks on his senses. But deep down, something inside him refused to accept that. He pulled into his driveway. The headlights cast long, eerie streaks across the wet pavement. His house was dark, quiet, exactly as he had left it. But stepping inside, something felt off. The air was different, thicker, heavier. He tossed his keys onto the counter, but the sound barely registered. The house was too quiet. Orion had always been there to greet him, his tail thumping against the floor, his nails clicking against the hardwood. The silence now was unbearable. Cashin exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. He was a soldier, a man who had faced death more times than he could count. He didn't get rattled by shadows or tricks of the mind. Still, the weight in his chest wouldn't lift. He moved toward the living room, his eyes scanning the space as if expecting to see Orion sprawled on his usual spot by the couch. But, of course, it was empty. He sat down heavily, the folded flag from the funeral still in his hands. His fingers ran over the fabric absent-mindedly, his thoughts a tangled mess. And then a noise. It was subtle, a faint thump like the sound of something shifting against wood. Cashin's head snapped up, his heartbeat quickened. He turned his gaze toward the hallway, where the shadows stretched long and dark. Then another sound, the distinct jingle of a collar. Cashin shot to his feet, his pulse hammering. His eyes darted toward the source of the sound, the entrance to his bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, barely moving, as if someone had just passed through it. He took a slow step forward, his muscles tense, his breath shallow. His rational mind screamed for an explanation. The house was locked. He was alone. There was no possible way that sound could have come from inside. And yet his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive in the field, told him that he was not alone. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, Cashin hesitated. A soldier's gut feeling was rarely wrong. Every part of him braced for the unknown. Then, in the suffocating silence, he heard it, a single, low whine. Orion's whine. Cashin's breath hitched. The sound was unmistakable, low, mournful, carrying the same tone Orion had used whenever he had sensed something wrong. It sent a chill down his spine. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but there wasn't one. His K-9 partner was gone, buried. He had seen the casket lowered into the ground with his own eyes. And yet, he took a slow step forward. His boots made no sound against the wooden floor. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and unervingly still. The door to his bedroom was slightly ajar, shifting just barely, as if responding to some unseen force. Cashin's fingers twitched instinctively, reaching for the sidearm holster at his waist. Except there was nothing there. He had left his weapon locked away, believing, foolishly, that there was no danger inside his own home. Another whine, closer this time. His pulse roared in his ears. Every hair on his body stood on end. Cashin wasn't a man prone to fear. He had walked through war zones, faced death head-on more times than he could count. But this was something else. His hand reached for the door, hesitating just for a second. Then, with a slow push, he let it swing open. The bedroom was dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp outside. Everything was exactly as he had left it, except for one thing. The indentation on the bed. Cashin's throat went dry. Right there, on the neatly made covers, was the unmistakable shape of a dog's resting place. A shallow dip in the mattress, as if Orion had just lain down. He stared at it, his body refusing to move. Then, without warning, the air shifted. A sudden rush of cold swept through the room, raising goosebumps on his arms. And then the scent hit him. Orion. The distinct smell of his dog's fur, clean but with that familiar earthy undertone. Cashin staggered back, his mind spinning. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. And yet, the evidence was right in front of him. His breath came in slow, controlled inhales, the way it did in battle when he needed to steady his nerves. He took a careful step closer, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Orion," he whispered. The room answered with a soft exhale of breath. Cashin froze, his chest constricted. That sound had come from right in front of him. His vision wavered between logic and belief, between what his senses were telling him and what his mind refused to accept. And then, just as he was about to speak again, something pressed against his leg, warm, solid, a presence he knew better than anything in the world. His breath caught in his throat, his body locked in place. Because no matter how impossible it was, no matter how much his brain rejected the idea, he felt it. Orion was here. Did you feel that? The chills, the racing heart. What would you do if you sensed the presence of someone who was gone? Cashin believes Orion is back. But how is that possible? Comment below? Do you think it's real, or just his mind playing tricks on him? Cashin stood frozen, every muscle in his body locked in place. He felt it Warm, solid, unmistakable, the weight against his leg, pressing gently, exactly like Orion used to do when seeking reassurance. His breath came in slow, uneven pulls, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't grief. This wasn't exhaustion. This was real. The air around him was heavy, thick with something unseen. The scent of Orion, earthy and familiar, lingered as if his dog had just walked into the room. Cashin's throat tightened. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, for any explanation that could make sense of what was happening. But deep inside, something else whispered to him. You know it's him. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered his hand. His fingers trembled as they reached into the empty space beside him. Except it wasn't empty. His fingertips brushed fur. Cashin gasped, staggering back. His hand burned with sensation, every nerve alive with the impossible reality of what he had just touched. He stared at his palm, as if expecting to see proof. But there was nothing. No fur, no sign that anything had been there. The weight against his leg had vanished. The presence was gone. His breath came fast and shallow. He turned sharply, scanning the room, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Nothing, just the empty dimness of his bedroom and the faint rustling of the rain outside. His gaze fell back on the bed. The indentation was still there, deep, unmistakable, as if something had only just risen from it. His pulse roared. His thoughts spiraled. Had he imagined it? Was his mind so desperate to hold on to Orion that it had conjured a touch that wasn't there? But the sensation still lingered on his skin. The warmth, the pressure, the impossible reality of it all. Then, from the doorway, something shifted. A shadow moved, low to ground. Swift, silent. Cashin's breath hitched as his head snapped toward it. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. Muscles tense in raw instinct, and then the floor creaked, just once. A single soft sound. And that was when Cashin knew Orion was still here. Not as a memory, not as a trick of the mind. Something more. A cold chill ran through him. Not fear, not panic, but something else. Something deeper. Something that made his hands tremble and his throat tighten. Because if Orion was still here, it meant this wasn't over. Not yet. Cash stood motionless, his mind trapped between belief and denial. The air in the room felt electric, charged with something he couldn't see but could feel, an undeniable presence pressing against his skin, wrapping around like an unseen force. The sensation of Orion's touch still lingered on his leg, warm and real, despite the fact that his dog had been buried hours ago. He swallowed hard, his breath shaky. The floorboard had creaked. The shadow had moved. Every instinct told him this was real, and yet his logical mind resisted. His body was exhausted, his emotions raw. Maybe this was all just his grief manifesting. Maybe his mind was conjuring Orion in the only way it knew how. But then another sound, a soft rustling from the hallway. Not the wind, not the house settling. Something deliberate. Cashin turned sharply toward the doorway, every muscle tensing. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the floor, but beyond that, the hallway was dark. Too dark. His pulse quickened. He had been alone when he came home. He had locked the door. Yet, as he took a slow step forward, an overwhelming sense of expectation filled the air. It was the same feeling he had before an ambush, when the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then he heard it, a soft, barely audible scratch against the hardwood floor. His chest tightened. That sound, it was familiar. Orion had always scratched at the door when he wanted to go outside, a habit he had never broken, even after retirement. The sound had been constant in Cashin's life, a small, everyday noise. But not anymore. Cashin's fingers curled into fists. His throat was dry. Orion, he whispered. Silence. He took a cautious step toward the hallway, his body on high alert. He felt ridiculous talking to an empty house, but every part of him was screaming that it wasn't empty. His gut twisted. Something wasn't right. Then, as if an answer to his hesitation, something moved in the darkness. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. Something real. Cashin's breath stalled. A chill crawled down his spine as he saw it. Just at the edge of the hallway, barely visible in the dimness, A shape, low to the ground, unmoving, watching. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. His rational mind screamed for an explanation, but his instincts, the ones that kept him alive in war, knew the truth before his brain could process it. Orion was here, and he wanted something. Cashin's breath came slow and controlled, but inside his mind was racing. His eyes remained locked on the shape in the hallway, low to the ground, silent, waiting. The dim light barely illuminated its form, but Cashin felt it more than he could see it. Presence. Familiar. Orion. His rational mind screamed at him. This is impossible. His partner was gone, buried beneath the old earth. And yet something in his gut, the same instinct that kept him alive in war zones, told him that what he was seeing was real. Orion was here. But why? Cashin swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Orion. The figure didn't move, didn't fade. Just stood there, waiting. The silence was suffocating. Cashin took a slow step forward, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. The moment his foot touched the ground, the shadow in the hallway shifted. A flicker of movement, small, deliberate. Cashin's pulse hammered against his ribs. He had seen Orion move like that before, stealthy, cautious, like he was leading him somewhere. His gut twisted. Was that what this was? A message? Then the scratching started again, soft, repetitive, intentional. Cashin's stomach clenched. The sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost like a pattern. His brain struggled to process it. But then a memory surfaced, unbidden. Years ago, during a mission overseas, Orion had been trained to alert Cashin to hidden dangers, explosives, enemy movement, anything unseen. When words weren't an option, Orion used scratching patterns to communicate urgency. Cashin's chest tightened. This wasn't just a ghostly presence. Orion was trying to tell him something. His hands curled into fists. His breathing slowed. He focused. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. 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 Cashin's blood ran cold. 3 short scratches, 1 pause, 1 longer scratch. A message. A code. It hit him like a gunshot. Orion had used that exact sequence before on their last mission together. The mission where Orion had saved his life. Cashin's pulse roared in his ears. His mind spun. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. Orion had come back for a reason, and whatever it wasn't over yet. Cashin's heartbeat pounded like war drums against his ribs. The room around him felt smaller, suffocating. The air thick with an unseen presence. The scratching had stopped, but its message burned in his mind. 3 short scratches, a pause, 1 long scratch. Orion had used that signal before, and it had saved his life. His mind reeled back to that night, the mission that had nearly been his last. It was supposed to be a routine patrol through an abandoned compound, but Orion had sensed something wrong. The dog had stopped abruptly, ears perked, body rigid. Then he scratched the ground in that same pattern. Cashin had hesitated, trusting his partner's instincts, and stepped back. Seconds later, an IED detonated just ahead. If Orion hadn't warned him, he would have been torn apart by the blast. And now, Orion was warning him again. A slow, deliberate creak sounded behind him, snapping Cashin back to the present. His breath caught in his throat. That wasn't the house settling. That was a footstep. The hair on his arm stood on end. He wasn't imagining this. He wasn't losing his mind. Someone was inside his home. He pivoted sharply, his pulse hammering, his instincts screaming at him to act. His eyes swept the room in seconds. The kitchen, the hallway, the shadowed corners. Empty. But then his gaze landed on the back door. His stomach twisted. It was unlocked. Worse, it was open. The door swayed ever so slightly, caught in the breeze. The damp air from the storm outside seeped into the house. His breath came slow, controlled. I locked that door. He knew he had. Locking doors had been muscle memory since his deployment days. An instinct as natural as breathing. If the door was open now, it meant someone had been inside. Or worse, was still inside. Then a growl, low, menacing right behind him. Cashin's entire body tensed. The sound rumbled through the air, deep and guttural. The kind Orion used to make just before attacking a threat. But it wasn't possible. Orion was gone. His grave was fresh. His body had been laid to rest. And yet, Cashin felt him. The presence was real. The warning was real. Orion had never been wrong before. And if he was growling now, it meant one thing. Cashin wasn't alone. Cashin's breath came in slow, measured pulls. But inside, his body was on high alert. His muscles tensed. His senses sharpened. Every nerve in his body screamed that something was very, very wrong. The growl that filled the air moments ago had faded, but the weight of it still lingered in his chest. He wasn't imagining things. Orion had given a warning, and now Cashin knew why. His eyes locked onto the dark figure standing near the back door, barely visible in the shadows. A man dressed in dark clothing, his posture tense, his presence deliberate. Cashin's stomach twisted. An intruder. His instincts roared to life. How long had this man been inside? Had he been watching, waiting? Orion had sensed him before, just like always. Then a faint glint of steel. Cashin's eyes flicked downward. A knife. The man was armed. His grip on the weapon was tight, his stance shifting slightly, assessing, ready to strike. Cashin knew that movement well. Predatory. The intruder wasn't here to steal. He was here to kill. Cashin felt his body coil like a spring, his training taking over. His fingers itched for a weapon, but he had none. He had come home from the funeral unarmed, never expecting that he would need to defend himself in his own house. A mistake. But before Cashin could move, something else did. A snarl ripped through the air, low, feral, and filled with a rage Cashin hadn't heard since Orion had been alive. The sound was so powerful that it sent a shiver down his spine. The intruder reacted instantly. His head snapped toward the source, his body stiffening. Then he stumbled backward, his hands flailing. His foot caught against the threshold of the open door. His entire body jerked violently as if something unseen had slammed into him hard. The knife clattered to the floor. Cashin's breath hitched. He hadn't touched him. No one had. But the intruder's face twisted in pure, unfiltered terror. His eyes widened, staring at something just over Cashin's shoulder. Something Cashin couldn't see. His lips parted in a strangled breath. His entire body trembled. And then, without another second of hesitation, he ran. Cashin watched motionless as the man bolted to the open door, disappearing into the night, as if he were being chased by something he couldn't escape. His footsteps pounded against the pavement outside, frantic, desperate. Cashin didn't follow. He couldn't. His chest was too tight. His mind still racing to process what had just happened. And then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the presence faded. The thick, suffocating air lifted. The weight pressing against Cashin's skin eased. The scent of Orion, earthy, warm, familiar, dissipated. The house was still again, silent. But Cashin knew it wasn't the same. It would never be the same. Orion had been here. His partner, his protector, even in death. His final duty fulfilled. A lump rose in Cashin's throat. He swallowed hard, blinking against a sudden sting behind his eyes. He exhaled shakily, then whispered, "Good boy." His voice was rough, edged with emotion, and just for a second, so brief, he almost questioned it. He felt something pressed against his leg. Warm, solid, real. And then it was gone. Did you enjoy this emotional story? Then leave a like for more amazing content like this. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next thrilling stories. Comment. Do you believe the bond between a dog and its owner can go beyond life? Share this with someone who needs to feel this chill too.